So thanks for joining us today. It's really great to see all of you here at Perry World House on Locust Walk here at the University of Pennsylvania, and greetings to those of you who are online on Zoom. I'm LaShawn Jefferson, the Senior Executive Director here at Perry World House, Penn's Hub for Global Engagement. And I'm really, really excited to see you here and to share with you this program today. It's my pleasure to welcome you all today. And as I said, some for the first time, some of you are repeat visitors, and happy to see you. And we like to do a couple of housekeeping things before we begin our program, and I'm going to make them really quick so that we don't delay the main event. We have Q&A as a part of all of our programs. There is a mic on my right. At some point during this panel, Avery will urge you all to begin to line up and to ask questions. Please do. For those of you who are online, as you well know by now, you can use the Q&A function to drop your questions, and we urge you to do so. Similarly, you can use the chat function if you're having any technical problems, and as our panelists speak today, we will drop resources for you in the chat function. We have closed captioning online. For those of you who are online, I presume you know how to use the drop-down button to in fact get to that. And the purpose of all of these discussions is that we learn from one another. So I would ask that we are patient with one another and that we approach all of these convenings with the idea of sharing ideas across communities. And that when it does come time for questions, that they're brief and that there's a question mark at the end of it, that it's an actual question. This week's The World Today will address how the U.S. and Australian militaries view strategic competition between the United States and China and critical areas of focus, such as the Pacific Islands, the role of alliances, and the Taiwan Straits. At this time, I'd like to introduce and welcome Colonel Leon Perkowski, Assistant Professor in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College and Director of the Eisenhower Series College Program. Leon will introduce our speakers and moderator and give you some background information on the Eisenhower Program. Thank you very much.
LaShawn, thank you for that kind introduction. It's great to be here with you all today. I grew up about 2 hours north of here and remember as a kid being impressed by the Franklin Institute and the Liberty Bell, and now I'm impressed by this lovely institution here. Before we get started with our panel today, I want to provide just a little bit of context about what we represent, what an Army War College is, what the Eisenhower Series program does, and then I'll introduce our moderator and our panelists. So the Army War College is located about 2 hours away from here in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and it provides a land power-centric graduate education to accomplished military professionals and civilians from various agencies in our government. It's an education that's delivered over 10 months, and it's designed to prepare these officers, for the next level of responsibility. And part of that preparation is to become better aware of how to communicate effectively to civilian policymakers, because they're going to encounter those types of leaders more and more as they rise in rank. And that's where this program comes into place. The Eisenhower Series College Program has been around for more than 50 years. It started back in the Vietnam War when we were having difficulties in our civil-military relationships, and we decided to reach out to the public and develop better mutual understanding. And that mission continues to this day. Our program is all about improving mutual civil-military understanding of national security issues. And so this program is an elective that our students take as part of their graduate education. And we ask the students to broaden their knowledge that they've already attained over 20 years of service in the military or their agencies by doing additional research on a topic that's of interest to them. And so you should not consider them to be subject matter experts like one of your professors, perhaps, but rather they provide an informed practitioner's perspective on the issues that they've been living with at various levels of the military for their entire career. We really value the dialogue that we have with you. So thank you for being here today, and we look forward to your questions after our moderated discussion. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce our various speakers here today. First, our moderator, Dr. Avery Goldstein, is a David M. Knott Professor of Global Politics and International Relations in the Political Science Department, inaugural Director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China, and Associate Director of the Christopher H. Brown Center for International Politics at the University of Pennsylvania. His research focuses on international relations, security studies, and Chinese politics. To my right is Lieutenant Colonel Joe England. He is an Army intelligence officer from Texas with over 20 years in the U.S. Army and in the Army Reserve. He has held strategic level intelligence assignments in Japan, Korea, and Iraq. As a civilian, he worked at a Big Four strategy consulting firm, and most recently as the National Vice President of Sales for a digital health company. Next, we have Colonel Tony Bennett, an infantry officer from Australia who has served at strategic level headquarters and on his nation's nuclear-powered submarine task force. He has commanded at every level, both domestically and overseas, and has deployed operationally to Timor-Leste, the Solomon Islands, the Philippines, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And finally, we have Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Sullivan, who is a civil affairs officer with 22 years of military service. She served as a lead planner in Korea and at NATO Land Command in Turkey. She has deployed to Afghanistan, Iraq, and Kosovo, and most recently served as the commander of a civil affairs task force with teams deployed across the Pacific Island countries. And before I hand this over to Dr. Avery Goldstein, I just want to add our normal disclaimer that we want to have a candid conversation here with you today. And to do that, you should understand that we are expressing our own personal opinions and not the official positions of the United States Army, the US government, or the government of Australia while we're here. And so with that, I would like to hand it over to our panelists to give you an overview of some brief comments, starting with the more narrow topic of looking at Taiwan and then broadening out to the greater Pacific area with our other two speakers. So Joe, go ahead and kick us off, please.
Thank you, Leon. Thanks everybody for taking the time today to meet with us and engage in this great dialogue. Really looking forward to it in the questions. As Leon mentioned, I'm Joe England. I have served in the Army as an intelligence officer for a little over 20 years. The first 4 years of that were on active duty. I was on an ROTC scholarship at Texas Christian, and when I graduated, I was commissioned as an officer in the U.S. Army. Following that time, I made the decision to actually leave active duty and join the U.S. Army Reserve, where I continue to serve to this day. And I probably bring a little bit of a different perspective to some of the topics we're going to discuss today. Over 80% of my average week is spent in the commercial sector in corporate America. That's been mostly a mix of management consulting, business-to-business sales, and growth initiatives in corporate America. And I'm really interested in a lot of the interplay we see at a national level when it comes to foreign policy and the different instruments of national power. One of my main topics that I'm researching this year as part of this program is the economic ramifications of what we would be facing, first order, second order effects, in the event of any type of hostile action between China and Taiwan, if that came to pass. More than happy to get into some Q&A around that. I'm sure there's a lot of questions, but I'll go ahead and pass it to the next panelist. Thanks.
Hey, thanks, Joe. Thanks very much for hosting us today. It's fantastic to be here. I must say I've been to two universities in Philadelphia today, and both of them play rugby, so I'm feeling at home a bit, given that rugby is a major sport back home. As Leon said, I am an infantry officer, but in the last sort of 3 years before coming here, I found myself surrounded by a lot of Navy people and indeed whole of government people as we did some research and did some work in reviewing Australia's strategic environment and the requirements that come with that. Ultimately, this led to working with the governments of the United States and the governments of the United Kingdom to get to a security pact known as AUKUS. And I think, most of the people in the room would have heard that before. But what got me thinking then, as we unpicked all of the risks that are associated with creating another security pact, effectively another mini-lateral relationship in that region, given the number of the others, and the fact that it didn't go down too well with the French, as most of you would already know as well. And so risking some relationships, not just Australian relationships, but of course, the United States had your own challenges initially with that as well. Was looking at, well, there are a lot of partnerships that already exist in the Indo-Pacific. Here's another one, and we are increasingly creating more. Is the risk and are the costs worth the benefit of it? And ultimately, like many, you come to the conclusion that the answer to that is yes, you go with your gut feel. But when you dig a little bit deeper into it and find out the reasons why, what is the change in the environment that's driven this, what is China's actual activity and how is that coercing, particularly middle powers and small states? The requirement to come together under a common cause, and in this case, that common cause I've just described, is much more powerful than trying to unpick it alone. So look, really happy. I'm really keen to get perspectives from you in the audience or online to have a bit of a chat and a bit of a question. Thank you. Over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is truly an honor to be here and to sit on the stage where, from so many pictures I've seen, so many greats have been here. So thanks for having us. I'm Rachel Sullivan, and as Leon mentioned, I'm a civil affairs officer. Civil affairs might be a branch that most of you aren't very familiar with. We don't shoot things. We don't ride in tanks. We don't really do anything that most people see, but we're really big about partnerships and relationships and engagement and working with people. That's really what we do. We work with people. And so when I took command of Task Force Oceania in Hawaii 2 years ago, and I was told that my teams were going to be going out to the Pacific Island countries, the Solomon Islands and Kiribati and Palau and the Marshall Islands, I nodded and smiled for a little bit and then ran and grabbed a map. Because I had absolutely no idea where many of them were. And I very quickly figured out not only where they were, but then recalling back to high school history and everything and how really key and strategic their locations were and how important they were during the war in the Pacific during World War II for the island hopping. And as my teams went out across these islands, something else that I learned was really how important our relationship with them was. And while the U.S. had a very strong relationship with the Pacific Islands following World War II, it was really something we'd let lapse here recently. And in our place, China has really surged. They've opened many embassies, they've deployed defense attaches, they've built ports, they've built airports, they've surged a lot of businesses into the area and even entered into security cooperation agreements with forces that in the past we've worked with very closely. So my teams, we really struggled early on, but finally got our footing with how do we compete with that? And maybe from our perspective, it was more tactical competition than strategic at the time, but certainly with strategic impacts. And what we learned was that the relationships that we brought to the table were really where we compete, and that's the strength that we had. And I look forward to talking a bit more about that with all of you. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all three of our speakers. Remarkably, we are ahead of schedule, which is great because I'm really determined to reserve plenty of time for the audience to be able to ask questions and explore topics with the speakers that we may not get to. We also have the online crowd who wants to ask their questions. I'm going to pull back a little bit. Now, the panelists have been forewarned that I'm going to ask some big questions, which may not be part of their day-to-day portfolio, but I think they've all got sufficient experience. And I know I personally am used to hearing academics talk about these things. I want to hear what some people who are involved in the practice of international relations have to say about these things. And there's really three buckets of topics that were previewed in the announcement about this event. One was this topic of strategic competition. The other had to do with the role of allies and partners in the region for the United States. And the third had to do with the prospect for conflict over Taiwan, something that's been touched on lightly already. So let me start with strategic competition, and I'll give each of the panelists a little bit of time to say what they want to say about these things. You might have heard in the past week or so, there was a balloon that somehow flew over the United States and might have had something other than a weather instrument panel attached to it. But I really think that the event has reminded us how fraught the U.S.-China relationship is now. And it's really not news. We've known for the past 5-6 years that U.S.-China relations are growing more tense. And a lot of people began speculating that in some ways, this was like a new kind of Cold War, different in some important ways, but still some parallels with the old Cold War with the Soviet Union that almost nobody in this audience will recall, maybe not even any of our panelists. But I'm wondering if you could do two things for us. One you know about, because I told you I was going to ask this, which is if you can draw some comparisons, if you see any important similarities or differences between the U.S.-Soviet rivalry of the Cold War and current day U.S.-China rivalry. The other thing is, given the fact that you work in military institutions, is there institutional memory about the Cold War experience that informs the way the military thinks about and approaches the new challenges from China. So how about, want to go in reverse order and start with Rachel?
I can do that. That's a fantastic question, and you guessed correctly. I was, I think, maybe 14 at the end of the Cold War. So my recollection of it is largely what I've learned in history and military history and studying and everything, and less from personal experience. But I think one of the big similarities that stands out to me, and we talked about a few of them on the way up. I won't steal all of them, so these guys have something to say. But I think one of the big similarities, and one that gives me hope that maybe we're not hurtling down too fast a path toward conflict, is the diplomatic relations. The fact that we continue to talk with China, the fact that we continue to hold, even though very, very modest, we continue to hold the military exchanges and exercises with China that we've held for many, many years. And I think that was something, though maybe not on the military exchange side, the fact that we always had that diplomatic approach, that we held those conversations, that we had that hotline to the Soviet Union, and although maybe not frequently used, the hotline today between the presidents of PRC and the US. I think that that's a positive thing. And I think that hopefully will remain something that we can always come together and talk to prevent conflict. And in terms of, are we looking at that? I will say that I've truly enjoyed studying the grand strategy of the US during the Cold War to look at and try to inform maybe how we should be looking at grand strategy today, and how in entering back into a period of strategic competition, what lessons can we draw? What lessons shouldn't we draw? And really, how can we use that to help inform the way we move forward?
Well, thank you. Yeah, that is a very good question. And indeed for Australia, a slightly different context because geography matters. Of course, Australia wasn't geographically that close to where the Cold War played out in most part. Yet the fear of an expansion of a country further from the north coming down to the south that would maybe compromise or challenge our values, rules-based order, our freedoms, sounds all too familiar now for some pundits in Australia who argue that we are entering that same era at this time. I think there's two key things for Australia. One time, this time, it's much closer to home. So the strategic competition is happening much more on our doorstep. And the second piece is we see, certainly for our perspective, just the volatility that is rising that makes the Indo-Pacific such a serious and challenging and unpredictable flashpoint as it occurs in competition. And then how do we balance against that? You know, Australia clearly has a very strong alliance with the United States and has had so since a long way before 1957, but of course formalised in 1957 with the ANZUS Treaty. But how do we still balance that with our responsibilities to support regional smaller states or middle powers with their resiliency against Chinese coercion, and particularly in the face of that competition?
I think the other perspective I would add is the world is getting increasingly interconnected, and in more ways than just from preserving nations' national security interests, particularly economically. And when you look at the variety of trade organizations, whether they're bilateral, trilateral, they've involved economic interests versus sovereign nations, there is a lot of overlap and there are a lot of mutual interests. I am very optimistic in the long run that there's tremendous opportunity for us to partner even with adversaries, and through those nuanced conversations, find opportunities to partner together for mutual gain and benefit. Even if in some regards we're in competition. You know, one of the reasons that I focus a lot of my research on Taiwan is because it would be economically devastating. Obviously, it comes as probably no surprise. If there were even a blockade of Taiwan. I mean, we're talking, Rhodium Group put out great piece of information on, you know, even within the first couple of weeks, you're talking about $2 trillion before you even get to second order effects. And I think it's because of situations like that, that there are opportunities to have positive conversations. And this comes on the heels of the last 20th party where Xi did state that he is committed to a peaceful reunification with Taiwan, even though there are some actions that continue in the gray zone. And it also comes on the heels of China's new charm offensive, right? So China is expressing a greater commitment to peaceful and mutually prosperous interactions with other nations around the world. And I think that there's a silver lining in there if we make the right business and policy decisions.
Great, thanks. Those are three very good answers. Building off this idea of strategic competition, whatever its nature might be at present, and maybe the current tension is not just like the Cold War. Nevertheless, Secretary of State Blinken's trip to China was supposed to be part of an effort to build on dialogue with the Chinese in a more robust way than has been the case over the past 4 or 5 years. And they kept talking about guardrails. And I can tell you, as soon as the US started talking about guardrails, Chinese said, what does this mean? And they had to decide how to translate it. I'm wondering if you have some sense of what is meant by this idea of establishing guardrails. What are we guarding against? You know, what is the main point of, I mean, that seems to be the first step in rebuilding the relationship. So let's flip the order and start down with you, Joe.
Yeah, when I think about that, Dr. Goldstein, I think that, there's a great parallel, but going back to the Cold War, I think Russia, the Soviet Union, were very clear with what their intentions would be in the event of escalation. So one of the ways I interpret the guardrails comment is we understood very clearly what those red lines would be, and they were very clear about what they would do. And I think that we were a little bit more open, and maybe that hotline that Rachel referred to earlier was a little bit more utilized, and we understood what a likely escalation or would be and when we would and would not escalate. I think the impetus of one of the reasons for Secretary Blinken's trip, as well as our efforts to reach out diplomatically with the PRC, is to help establish those common guardrails while we are in competition. Because heaven forbid, something does happen and somebody takes it the wrong way, or they choose to escalate, or they think it's an act of war, or it violates their no first use policy from a nuclear perspective, or something, an accident happens, and they do. We almost unfortunately had another accident in December with an EP-3 intelligence aircraft and a Chinese fighter jet. And you might remember 2001, the Hainan Island incident, where the exact same thing did happen. And we had, fortunately at that time, some pretty quick diplomatic action, even though it did result in a death of that PRC pilot. So I think those guardrails are critical. That's the way I've taken it. And even though we're still moving forward to try to establish mutual understanding with each other, we need to have some guardrails in place and parameters so things don't escalate out of control.
I tend to agree with Joe. I think the other important thing about establishing guardrails, and I note that only recently, at the end of last year, Australia's foreign minister managed to get and have an audience with a senior official in China after no communication in country since 2017. But the guardrails piece, acknowledging what Joe has just said, is also about identifying the opportunities inside what is effectively a lot of grey zone type activity across the instruments of national power, the opportunities that exist for countries to be able to use those, not just to achieve their own national interests, but also to slowly break down through non-military means, barriers that exist to work towards de-escalation.
Yeah, so I feel like I'll probably just be saying almost the same thing, but to me, I think I always heard guardrail and in my mind thought of a commitment to dialogue, a commitment to come together and talk before we let things get out of control. So again, whether it's a misinterpretation of actions, of an exercise, of a visit, of a discussion, of a weather balloon, that commitment to talk, that commitment to come together and dialogue and find the way to use that as a way to release the tension rather than continue to build it.
All right, so the second bucket of questions has to do with allies and partners in the region. I'm keeping one eye on the clock here. And one of the features of the U.S. security cooperation in the Asia-Pacific, now Indo-Pacific, has been this idea of a hub and spokes, where the spokes are the many important allies and partners of the United States, and also some may not formally be partners, but there's certainly places we want to engage with more, as Rachel was pointing out in Oceania. So the question here is, we know that these are allies and partners, and we know in general they share a perception that China at a minimum poses new challenges that it didn't pose before, perhaps risks of coercion. So maybe you want to just emphasize the areas where the US and its allies and partners have common interests. But I'm wondering if you think there are areas where the US has a different perspective, or partners and allies have different perspectives from the United States, that could be sources of tension when certain issues, certain problems arise, whether it has to do with trade and investment policy, or a crisis over Taiwan, or something else. And since this is about allies or partners, let's start with our ally first.
Thanks, Doc.
Australians.
Thanks, Dr. Goldstein. That is a great question, and it's a very tricky one, no matter which part of the world you're in, but particularly tricky from, certainly, I think, an Australian perspective, you know, given that history always matters. And so inside that region, you know, not least of which since World War II, there has been wars fought against each other. There's been atrocities committed against one country to another. And so the challenge that exists just up front is the answer to the question about can you achieve a NATO, for example, in South Asia, is it's very difficult. Each country goes about achieving their interests and their values and their objectives differently within the region. And they do so simply because they have no other choice. If I think about then some of the areas where tear lines might, not tear lines, not a great example, where diversion might exist. From an Australian perspective, we are still challenged slightly by, you know, maintaining and strengthening lately our alliance, not just with the US, but across the Indo-Pacific, as we do see a common threat to our values and the rules-based order as part of that. But we also want prosperity, like many other countries. We're a middle power that exists inside great power competition. And so we seek a level of prosperity, and 80% of trade that goes out of Australia goes to China. So reopening trade routes in there when we are seeking diplomatic and economic gains may not be congruent at times, depending on what's happening between the competition between the United States and China itself. Similarly, I think outside of Australia, there are borders, both land and maritime, which are not recognised necessarily by China and neighbouring countries. And the United States may have different views on when those lines are crossed and when they're not for other nations that exist in the region.
Rachel, you want to pick up on this, since you've dealt with some of the countries that we didn't pay attention to, all of us, for a long time.
Absolutely. So I think that I think very frequently we tend in the U.S. to look at things, you know, very black and white, and us against them, a zero-sum game, right? If we want you to be our partner, we don't want you to be China's partner. And I think that that's something that that really is a source of friction with our allies, and for good reason, I believe. One perspective that we were shown in the Pacific Island countries, many of these countries are still very much in a development status and have very little in the way of key infrastructure. Think hospitals, think very simple bridges to, you know, connect some of the atolls to the main island that has access to the international airport. And while that's not really an area that the US deals with in terms of development, our development tends to be more in areas, in small scale areas of public health, public education, democracy building. China does do a lot of large-scale infrastructure projects, and large-scale infrastructure projects are what many of these islands need to help them be able to take care of their populations and help them continue their growth towards prosperity. So I think that frequently one of our What we have to maybe take a step back and remember is that things don't have to be a zero-sum us or them game. Again, that partnership, that relationship that we bring, and our own flavor of that relationship. It doesn't have to offset. It doesn't have to replace what China is doing, but it can still be an offset, and we can become a partner of choice.
Those were two great perspectives. I think the only additional flavor I would add to that, and this will probably seem a little thematic at this point, but just as there are organizations where, whether it's a lack of misunderstanding or just interpretation, the new AUKUS arrangement, Australia, UK, US, the quadrilateral security dialogue, since we're talking about the Indo-Pacific, China has voiced very openly that they are anti everything that those entities are doing. On the flip side, you look at other types of economic cooperatives and partnerships like the Comprehensive Progressive TPP, where mutual interests do align and they've applied for membership. I think the only thought that I would suggest is that having a seat at the table matters. It enables us to have dialogue with one another and help pursue mutual interests. And it's something that, national policymakers obviously consider as part of the strategic repertoire and how we're going to interact with nations. And so I think a lot of where you see allies and partnerships materialize is through those partnerships, through security dialogues. And a lot of times, I think things get lost in translation in terms of what the intent is and what the potential could be.
So I saved the Taiwan bucket for last because I know from decades of experience then talking about U.S.-China relations, once you introduce Taiwan, it just sucks the air out of the room. That's all you talk about. So I'm sure the audience is going to raise questions on that. And we have maybe 3 or 4 minutes to let you each say something about Taiwan. And Joe, you've already said something. So the economic consequences of a conflict there obviously will be enormous for a variety of first and second order effects. And has led people sometimes to say, well, because China understands this, US understands this, and certainly people on Taiwan understand this, that they understand that military conflict really isn't an option, that there are economic reasons why there won't be a military conflict. Do you agree with that? Or do you think that in the circumstances where either China or the United States or Taiwan would consider resorting to military force, they would even think about the economic consequences? In other words, when you think about circumstances where you're really at a moment of crisis that looks like it could become open conflict, do those economic calculations really have any significant weight? Because it certainly seems in the case of Ukraine that the obvious economic consequences didn't weigh too heavily on Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, absolutely. I think great parallel. And something that we were even discussing again on our right up here. I think one of the things to take into account is the US's trade with China and Taiwan is a little over 10 times annually what it is with Ukraine and with Russia. And we saw a lot of businesses pull out of Russia at the start of that conflict. We saw it contribute to certain supply shocks and raises in prices of certain utilities and sectors, agriculture, wheat, gas shocks, et cetera. In the event of a China-Taiwan scenario, the answer is I would hope so. I think that there are indicators that they would. Chris Miller wrote a great book, I'm sure some of you have read it, called Chip War. And in it, they talk about the Chinese billionaire Zhao and his interest and Taiwan's reciprocation to a degree. When looking at TSMC and looking at providing investment into large chip manufacturers like that. So I would, provide a point that there are economic interests from very influential people, even within the PRC, that certainly would come to the forefront. I think the long-term effects of what a military action would look like, there's a variety of demographic things within the PRC. And there's certainly a trend line across multiple business sectors in their economy that would indicate that they should be concerned if something did escalate because of what those long-term effects would be and what would happen even with foreign direct investments that they've got, it's about $775, $780 billion a year just that are held here in the United States. That would prompt sell-offs. There would be a variety of secondary effects that would directly impact both citizens in their country and their government as well.
So I think that I'm with Joe again here. I think that China is very cognizant of how powerful the economy part is for their nation. I mean, if you look again at the requirements that they have for incoming trade from countries like Australia, iron ore in particular, as they continue to try and build infrastructure to be able to support their modernisation of both the military but broader infrastructure within the country, the consequences to them are significant. And the CSIS, wargaming that Joe referred to earlier also highlights that. I think the risk remains clear that misinterpretation and miscalculation, given that Xi has also said that, peaceful reunification, however, we still reserve the right to use force if necessary. I think miscalculation can come into play here. I think particularly if you look at possible concurrency issues that are occurring along other border states and or climate change responses, shortages that might exist across food sources and water sources, that these things could contribute to overriding the logic of the economy piece.
Yeah, so I guess we're going to go downhill in the rosy picture here from Joe to Tony to I. But so again, I think like everyone, I would like to think that the economic aspects will be on everyone's mind and that it will win the day. But as Tony's pointed out, and beyond that, I mean, many of the challenges that China faces right now with their own economy internally, with some of their internal demographics, we know that President Xi has stated that he would like to see that the military should be ready to forcibly take Taiwan by 2027. We've heard statements like that made more commonly in the news and in the party Congress. And so I think that it's troublesome to see things going in that direction. And I think that it's something that we can't assume that the economy is going to win the day. I think it's something that we have to be ready for on all fronts of national power to keep our diplomatic relations hopefully in a place that they can help influence and again continue that dialogue, because I don't think that we can assume that the economy will win out in a last-minute decision if the Chinese Communist Party believes that their reputation and their survival is on the line.
Great, thanks for those answers. And now it's your turn, you in the audience. The microphone is over there. I hope people will walk up to the microphone with questions. I realize people tend to hold back before someone asks the first question. And we've got an online question that I can toss out there while we're waiting for people to screw up their courage to get to the microphone there. So first one here is, what is the probability that China will increase its efforts to take over Taiwan before the end of this decade? They're asking for the probability. Maybe you can frame that however you want.
Well, I'll start on that one. Really interesting report. Actually came out from our sister school from the U.S. Naval War College. So it's Maritime Report number 25. If you want to look it up, it's open source, China Maritime Studies Institute. One of the things I found interesting, because we're all in the Army, in the Australian Army, and thinking jointly is a critical skill. It's supposed to be. And I was looking at it, and I was looking at the increased activity along the highest traffic ports and key ports, and also based on proximity, right across the Taiwan Strait from the island of Taiwan. And if you'll look into that report is all about the emergence of roll-on, roll-off ferries, where China actively practices moving an incredible amount of maritime lift capability of putting militarized vehicles onto merchant vessels and ferries to move them. And they do this in a concealed manner under tarps and other equipment. You can still tell through the imagery in that open source product what they're doing. You couple that with the crossings of the Taiwan Strait centerline. That never used to happen. 11 ballistic missiles were fired last August in the fourth Taiwan Strait crisis to include over the island of Taiwan. That's never happened before. They established 2 new operational zones around Taiwan. One's actually in the South China Sea below their largest import-export port that contributes for about 60% of their imports and exports. That's brand new. So, there are a lot of provocations. So I guess the answer would be, I think that the likelihood is 100%. They've done things operationally to show that they're ready. And back to Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan's point on Xi's initiative that the PLA needs to be ready to conduct some type of military action against Taiwan by 2027. Now, the likelihood, would they do that, even if it was a blockade? It's an entirely different question. I don't have those figures, but yeah, that's my perspective. Thanks.
Does anybody else want to weigh in? We don't have to all answer every question. Should we take? Okay.
I'll just make a quick comment that I think that military buildup will certainly happen. I think in particular exercising. I think China continues, and Joe's just gone through a lot of the examples in there, but China continues to conduct military exercises with more forces and closer to the Taiwanese zones than they have in the past. And they're effectively, and I'm probably telling people here what they already know, they're seeking to normalize this over a period of time to be able to achieve reunification without conflict. So I would say 100% that military activity will continue to build up, not necessarily conflict.
So I guess Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan's pessimism now seems to be not an outlier. Tom.
So my question kind of follows up on what you've just been talking about. It'll focus on the issue of time and time windows. Like everyone in the US government seems to believe it's 2027. That may not be the invasion year, but the year that China has the capability to launch an invasion of Taiwan. And then a week or two ago, a general in the Air Force said, I think it's now 2025. So when does it become 2024? When does it become 6 months from now? When does it become tomorrow? So could you just talk about the pros and cons of like time windows that we're planning for this, but then is there a competition in the military to be the year before, so then maybe your service gets more funding and more fun stuff to shoot with or blow up? But it seems like the window is closing, and the window may be yesterday by the time we're done talking today.
And so I'll field this one. I think that it's very difficult and also perhaps very arbitrary to put time windows on these things, and that'll be the first thing. That's really my bottom line answer, is that it's very difficult to put time windows on any of this. We do know, again, the 2027 window, what we all call the Davidson window. I was working for Admiral Davidson when that became the Davidson window. That has more to do, with Xi's own remarks about the PLA being, ready by then. General Minahan's remarks have a lot to do with, firing up an air mobility corps that would have a significant role in any sort of conflict, but that is taking a huge sigh of relief as we come out of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and thinking that they've got an opportunity now to take a knee and not have to worry about readiness so much. So I think that we do all within the military, within our circles, within any government circles, you'll hear us all talk about the need for readiness, the need for having things in place to be able to off-ramp, or to be able to react, or be able to respond, or be able to go to conflict if that's what ends up happening. But I don't think that means that any of us really have a solid idea of what date that might be.
First off, I just want to thank you, sir, and thank you, ma'am, for your service to our nation. And sir, thank you for your service to an allied nation. My question, well, I'm not quite sure how to phrase it. I guess when I look at the geopolitical field and the competition between the United States and China, it seems like we are constantly reacting and we're never proactive. And I guess my question is, civil affairs wise, or in any way, how are we proactive to the situation without necessarily escalating it to a conflict?
I guess I'll take that one too. So I think that there's a lot, reactions are what we see on the news, right? We tend to, that gets a lot of press. We see those, we read about those. We don't read about a lot of the day-to-day. And I think that in the day-to-day, and I'll speak from the military perspective, but this is true really across all of our instruments of national power. So for the diplomatic, for the economic, I do believe it to be very true, but on the military side, we have very strong partnerships across the Indo-Pacific, very strong partnerships really across the entire globe. Those partnerships might be, military to military partnerships. They might be security cooperation, where we either sell or give equipment and help train partner forces on how to use that equipment. That might be governance building. That might be, working to build resiliencies and humanitarian assistance and disaster response. So we have a lot of day-to-day activities that we do that try to be proactive, so that we're not constantly on the reaction. But the fact of the matter is we'll always have to respond to things. And so that response will always be seen as being reactive, even where we've been very proactive and successful, hopefully with some of our proactivity.
Hi, my question is also for Colonel Sullivan. In thinking about what you mentioned with the Belt and Road Initiative and other kind of soft power measures that China has taken over the years, it feels like we're almost decades and millions behind in terms of investment in the human domain. And so what could you speak a little bit to the experiences that your civil affairs teams have had in terms of successes and challenges operating in that environment?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that, and I'll say that your impression is a common one. It's one that we struggled with, really, quite honestly, as I got ready to send the teams out to these Pacific Island countries that have had, in many cases, significant investment from China over the recent years. The teams would ask, how in the world can I go into this location and bring in these tiny, small scale, maybe an education project, maybe a health project, maybe all we're bringing in are some, PPE for COVID, but China recently built them a port. How do we compete with that? And my answer to my teams at the time was, let's just get in there and figure out what our partners need. And it turns out that's how we compete with that. We listen to our partners. We figure out what they need. What they need may not be what it is that China brings in. What they need may just be a little bit of training in how to deal with water and saltwater inundation because of sea level rise, and climate change. Things that our counterparts in China don't have any interest in addressing with our partners. So I guess what I'd say is we don't have to compete with a checkbook. We really should focus on our relationships and use that to compete.
So we've got about 10 minutes left, and I'm determined to get to every question in the audience. So let's try to make the question short.
Sure. Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan, I apologize. This question will be directed again towards you as the civil affairs officer in the room, but everyone, please feel free to answer. Beyond the balloon that we all saw in the news, there was another headline talking about the Philippines and a military agreement that we'd kind of reached that may or may not give us access in a military manner to some of those northernmost islands. Is this an example of a healthy relationship that you think the United States is building? Are we running the risk of triggering the type of response that we saw in Ukraine, where at least it was claimed to be a NATO aggression that caused the action? Or is this the kind of zero-sum variety? I'll pose that to you. Thank you. So yes and yes. It is the sign of a healthy relationship, most definitely. And actually, I'll let Tony talk a little bit more about this, but it's really I think a very positive thing, the reinvigoration of our relationship with the Philippines.
because we did see the possible cancellation of our visiting forces agreement just several years ago, and then very late in President Duterte's presidency, prior to President Marcos taking over, a bit of a pivot back toward the U.S. So I think it's a positive development, but I do also think it absolutely runs the risk of being seen by China as an escalation in the region. And I know Tony's got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think this is the strength of why so many smaller alliances and relationships matter over a single NATO type alliance that would exist in there. The Philippines is one such example. Japan and the US relationships are really important, which have progressed again recently. You think about AUKUS, people think about nuclear powered submarines because they're cool. That was meant to be funny, but in reality, it's about technology sharing, advanced technology, undersea technology, and the like. And so if you put that together, you see a reinvigorated Quad that's occurring. You see civil affairs reaching out to smaller nations. What they're really after, from my perspective and working in the Pacific, is they want assurances that the United States or their partners are going to be there when they need them. And so the human piece is absolutely on the money with it. That's the advantage. I mean, China doesn't have that many allies and partners.
Wondering about the possibility of technological surprises on a kind of shifting scale. I mean, we see in Ukraine the kind of emergence of very cheap drones, kind of DJI type drones. In The Economist, you hear about, underwater drones and all sorts of things like that. Do you think that could lead to some military surprise? And just as a comment, I'd say that 1949 will be 75 years ago in 2024. But anyway, just as a curiosity about the possibilities of a technological shift.
Thank you for that question. I think that we're absolutely seeing it happen today. I think, especially if you're looking at a potential where there's conflict or some sort of crisis, you're going to look for ways that you can achieve overmatch against an adversary, or at least posture in a way that gives you a significant advantage. China, in this instance, since that's the theme here, has really done that. Last year we saw the launch of their SJ-21 satellite with a robotic arm that was able to move another satellite that was no longer functional. They had a Cosmos out of low Earth orbit up through the geostationary orbit track belt into really the debris space. And quickly, the international community wondered what their intentions or other capabilities could be with that type of technology. Similarly, to your point, Russia and Ukraine. There has been GPS jamming before Russia invaded Ukraine and throughout that entire conflict. China has engaged in much of the same activity. So it can also be cyber or electronic warfare means. It could be spoofing. So we see technology, and this is probably where, if anything, I would say asymmetrically, I probably am more on Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan's, same sheet of music here in terms of maybe not having a rosy perspective because of actions that they take that are not what we would perceive safe.
Hi, good afternoon, speakers. Thank you for sharing. I refer to what was mentioned that the US tends to see things in black and white. And to this note, I was wondering how you feel about the more neutral parties like Singapore, and whether you foresee a situation where such neutral parties will be coerced by either sides to take sides.
Before you answer, I can say that there was an online question also. This is great because in addition to Singapore, it basically asks about Southeast Asian countries. Where do they fit into this picture?
Yeah, so it's a fantastic question, and one that's certainly in my work and in the work of my teams when they were out in these locations that I really sought for us not to be seen as trying to force our partners to make a choice between us or China. I think that many smaller countries and I guess middle powers, as Tony calls them, that's a huge concern, and it's something that we have to be aware of, and that we have to understand that we are oceans apart from this problem where many of them are not. So actually, I'm going to let Tony take the rest of this one.
So I think that's an excellent question. One of the best questions, certainly today. They've all been good, but I like that one. You know, Singapore, Indonesia, some of the other smaller nations, even way down into the Pacific where you look at Fiji. I mean, they are not, I mean, New Zealand, if you want to go all that way down, you know, they are countries, as you say, that are non-committal to either side. The challenge I think that we face is you have an increasing constellation of alliances that are occurring out there that are not deliberately pressuring other nations to have to make choices. The difference, of course, between the United States and many of its allies and China is that freedom of choice and freedom and rules-based order for that country, they get to make those decisions by themselves. We wouldn't seek to coerce somebody deliberately into doing so. I think the challenge becomes not everybody plays by those same rules. And so it is a real, it's a real focus area as the alliances spread and as partnerships strengthen. The indirect advantage of partners who are partners with other people, but not necessarily in another relationship, strengthens the possibility of resilience for those states.
Hi, good afternoon. This is kind of convenient. I think it kind of builds on the last question. I hope you didn't already answer too much of this, but my perception is that speaking of like middle power countries, the civil affair teams are very good for like smaller governments, smaller countries. But when you get into like bigger economies like Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam, the level of impact that could have is the tool is not meant for a different government. And then when you speak to countries like Japan, technology sharing, that type of thing is very effective. Can you guys speak to the opportunity for like non-military organizations from commercial organizations to get involved with sort of like the middle powers commercially to sort of achieve some of our strategic interests?
Yeah, I'd love to take that question. Thank you very much. You know, I've kind of danced around it a couple of times earlier. I think you see, whether it's through ASEAN in those kind of middle power countries, alliances forming around trade and commercial opportunity for mutual and collective benefit. The United States has bolstered relationships, is working diligently so with Vietnam. And I would say on the flip side, even where the PRC is involved, you know, I saw that they're planning on holding another, was it Golden Dragon exercise again in Cambodia? But you see larger international based trade organizations where people are applying for membership. I forget off the top of my head how many countries are in a pending status with applications seeking to join the CPTPP. But very similarly, you see countries wanting to join those organizations for shared understanding around economic trade practices, especially I think in the binding organizations where people can be held accountable in a good way because people understand what to expect. It also kind of ties back into the prior question too around, you know, economic coercion and bad debt lending that you see, and whether that's just to gain air basing and overflight or an actual partner in a conflict, you know, those would be seen as pretty coercive and repressive practices to most of us probably in this room. But I think there's definitely tremendous potential in that region.
Either you want to take on that, we're close to the end. Anybody want to make a closing remark before I make closing remarks? I think you've touched on most of the key topics here. So let me just wrap up with a few comments here, which are really more administrative than anything. I want to thank our panelists for joining us today for this important discussion. We're grateful for the continued partnership with the Army War College each spring and for the Center for the Study of Contemporary China for co-sponsoring this program. And I want to thank the audience for its participation in this edition of The World Today. We hope to see you again on Wednesday, February 15th at 4 p.m. There'll be a discussion co-sponsored with the Center for Africana Studies, the Marginalized Populations Project, and the Center for Latin American and Latinx Studies on the recent political unrest in Brazil. And then looking ahead to February 16th, there'll be an installment of the joint lecture series with the Andrea Mitchell Center for the Study of Democracy. And that program will focus on commercialized military power since 1945. And on February 21st, there'll be a program on Japan's new geopolitics after Abe. So as always, you can access a recording of this conversation on the Perry Worldhouse YouTube channel. And you can find out about the great events we have planned for the rest of the semester by visiting the Perry Worldhouse website. And you can join the mailing list and follow us on social media. For those of you who are in person here today, please feel free to go to the student lounge for a grab and go snack. And I want to thank everybody for being here with us today, and please join me in thanking our panelists.